Hi, my name's Dave Kung. I'm from the Dana Center at UT Austin, and I'll be talking with you today about math for the 21st century, interest-driven, equitable pathways aligned with student aspirations, higher ed pathways, and workforce needs. I'm looking forward to responding to you live in the Q&A in the chat, so please make use of that. I wanted to frame the session around two stories of success, but look really at how fragile their success was. And I think the moral of this is that we really need to broaden our view of mathematics, both like what the mathematics is, the content, but also who is seen as a math person, who sees themselves as belonging within the math community. If we really want the sort of equitable access and success that we all talk about, we really have to broaden our view from being one about classrooms, teachers, students, to one about systems. And in particular, I think we really have to tend to two fundamental problems. The current system is, first of all, outdated. We're not teaching content that's needed for the 21st century, and that's just not serving our students particularly well. And secondly, the current system is just deeply inequitable. And so to get into that, I want to talk about stories of two students, Maria and Marcus. So Maria is a student from the Rio Grande Valley here in Texas. She was aiming for the Ivy Leagues from middle school or so. She was identified by some of her teachers as having a lot of promise, and she really wanted to go to an Ivy League school and study English and psychology. Her advisors told her, if you want to get into those Ivy League schools, you really have to do calculus. She did an early college program, popular in Texas, and she ended up taking and passing calculus in high school. She got admitted to an Ivy League school, like totally along with her dreams. She ended up doing what she wanted. She got an English and psych double major. It took her a little bit longer than she hoped. Part of that was because somewhere in there she had to take statistics for the psych major. I want to also look at a student I'm going to call Marcus. So Marcus was from Baltimore. He had a strong interest in STEM fields from a fairly early age. He did 3 years of high school math. He got through pre-calculus, but then the high school that Marcus was at didn't offer calculus. There was no calculus available, so he didn't take any math in his senior year. Marcus, like so many students who are, who are Black and Brown, Latino, were experiencing poverty, chose to go through the community college system. Went through the community college system, but in part because he had had no math in his senior year, he placed into developmental education math. In fact, they told him he needed to do 3 levels of math before getting to calculus. That's what he did. He got through all those, got through calculus, and was on his way. It took him 3 years instead of 2, but he earned his associate's degree at the community college, transferred to a 4-year school, and then it took again a little bit longer, but completed a degree in physics in 3 years at the 4-year school. So before we come back, we'll come back and talk about Maria and Marcus, but I want to look at the system that these two students successfully navigated. At the Dana Center, we think really hard about critical transitions. And we're going to focus on the high school part, but we think of those critical transitions all the way back to early literacy. There's a transition from elementary to middle school. A lot of these transitions are about schools, like from middle school to high school. But somewhere around there, there's also a different sort of transition when students are going from the concrete mathematics of elementary school and transferring to the more abstract mathematics of algebra. And then later on, there's a transition from high school into higher education. It used to be sort of clean, but it's much more complicated now, especially with the rise of dual enrollment. But there's a high school higher ed transition, and in there, it's really key to be looking at that gateway math course. So that requirement that students have to pass in their college to get their degree, whether it's a 2-year degree or 4-year degree, or a certificate of some other some other kind. And then there's, of course, the transition to workforce that looks very different for different students. But these critical transitions are just incredibly important, in part because those transitions are where under-resourced students tend to fall through the gaps. They're also where equity issues are really exacerbated. I want to give you an example of this from earlier than what we'll talk about in high school. But one of the things working in Texas we found is that if you look at 5th graders who are doing well in math and you ask, do they get into 8th grade algebra, right? And 8th grade algebra is a benchmark because that's what you need to do in order to get into high school calculus. So do the students who are doing well in 5th grade make it to 8th grade algebra? And the answer was overall about 70% of them. But if you look at African-American students, that number was much lower, down in the 40s. And what we did working with local leaders in Texas, in Central Texas, is understand that it's much better. The current system was, the system at the time was an opt-in system. So people were asked, would you like to take algebra in the 8th grade? And just by making that into an opt-out system, where the default for students doing well in 5th grade was that they would get into 8th grade algebra, just doing that closed a lot of the gap in terms of different races getting into 8th grade algebra. It didn't solve all the problems, but just that one story sort of illustrates what we mean here by critical transitions. I also think that these transitions, because this is where the gaps open, where equity issues are exacerbated, that's where interventions are most needed. And I think this is really key. I also think it's where interventions are most effective. And just to give you an example of what I mean by that, you could give students like a double dose of a math class if you saw that they were in danger of falling behind. But if you do that in the middle of their time in a middle school, they're really likely to see that as sort of remedial, like, oh, I need more. But if you do that right at one of these transitions, if you do that like in their first year in a new school, say in high school, giving them a double dose of algebra, they're much more likely to just see that there's so much changing around them. They're much more likely to see that as just part of their new thing. Oh, I guess at this school you do 2 hours of a math class, right? And so you have an ability, you have an opportunity at those critical transitions to implement sort of intensification in ways that don't harm the sort of psychology of the students, but instead allow them to sort of to really propel them forward. Now, in these sessions, we're really looking at this high school, especially the high school higher ed transition, and what that. And I want to look at the default sequence in the U.S. for at least the last few decades. It starts with algebra, geometry, algebra 2, which goes back much longer than a couple decades, right? And, it has its roots in 1892 when the Committee of 10 agreed that on these as sort of the key topics as we go through high school math. And then some students continue on to pre-calc. I'm narrowing the boxes to indicate some don't, and some go on to calculus. And really this path toward calculus is really it's an artifact of a time when we were at odds with the Soviet Union, right? And trying to win the space race. And the math that we needed in order to do that everything was aimed at calculus. And students go through this. Some of them drop out of this path at some point, but no matter what you were doing, you go through this path. It didn't matter if you wanted to be, a STEM professional, somebody in humanities, or a nurse or an electrician. Everybody is sort of in this same pathway. I want to circle back and think about how Maria and Marcus navigated these critical transitions through this sort of historical system that we have in the United States. See, Maria, in addition to being really hardworking, she was kind of lucky. Like, she had access to calculus, and that's what propelled her forward. And in this sense, the calculus here is playing the role of a gatekeeper. And it would be a gatekeeper for anybody heading toward an Ivy League school, but it's particularly a gatekeeper for her because her interests were in English and psychology, and calculus is not particularly useful in either one of those. So let's look at exactly what this gatekeeper status of calculus looked like. Calculus is needed only for about 25% of undergraduate degrees, right? Most people getting a college degree don't really need calculus. It's really overvalued in admissions, and Just Equations has done some fantastic work on this. They have a couple of reports out, one looking at from the higher ed side at admissions, and one looking at from the high school side at advising and counseling, and what counselors think about the role of calculus. And in both cases, everybody thinks calculus, it uses calculus as like this proxy for the ability to do really well in college, right? Whether or not calculus, the content of calculus, has anything to do with their interests. We also know that access to high school calculus is incredibly inequitable, both by race and by income. If you look at schools, high schools that have a large number of students who are of color, they are much less likely. Those schools are much less likely to offer calculus. And if you look instead of by race, but if you look at by income, students with a high proportion of students coming from a low income background are much less likely. In fact, about half as likely as schools that have a much lower proportion of poor students. So we know that access to calculus is really inequitable across the board. So when we look at Maria and see that she actually had access to calculus, that is incredibly lucky. Many students in her situation, especially many Latina students like herself, don't have access to that because of the structure of our educational systems. But it's also, it's also just inappropriate from a content perspective. If she really only wanted an English major, she would probably be better off with a quantitative reasoning course. If she really just wanted the psych major, she might be better off just with a statistics course. And so this system that pushes her toward calculus as this gatekeeper, it's really just an unjust tax, both on her time and her effort. She had to take this course that didn't align with her interests. And then, in fact, in college, she had to go back and take a statistics course. Also, in thinking about what the math that she had, it's not really clear where she would get like the quantitative skills needed to be a responsible citizen, needed to like critically read the news. It's also not clear where she would get data skills that are increasing needed in so many fields. Like the system that she went through is this antiquated system that's really rooted in the Cold War in trying to win the space race in a time long before we had, we had cell phones and everything else. Let's look at Marcus. Remember, Marcus is a STEM-interested student who goes through community college. This is a view of Marcus's path through the mathematics system, including like a similar path, but then there was no math in his senior year, and so he skipped that in the middle. But then he took these 3 developmental math courses before finally taking calculus in community college and going on to get his degree in physics. Let's look at some lessons here. Like Marcus had a bunch of extra hurdles that other people wouldn't have. So first of all, he took no math in his senior year. Why is that a hurdle? We know from data, this is particularly from data in Texas, that students, if you take 2 students who are equal in all these other ways, if one student takes math in their senior year, a rigorous math course, they are 15% more likely to get a degree, get an undergraduate degree in the next 6 years. This is data, our friends at the Ready Center at Texas State pulled these data for us, but that 15% means that just not taking math in his senior year meant he was less likely to get a 4-year degree. Now, he didn't have calculus. He didn't have calculus in high school. He was not as lucky as Maria. There was no calculus available to him, but he also, and so that puts up an extra barrier. Also, he went through the community college path from high school to a 2-year degree and then to a 4-year degree. We know a lot about students who choose this. We know, for instance, that 80% of students who start in community college intend to get a bachelor's degree, but only 25% of them ever transfer to a 4-year school. And 17% of them get a bachelor's degree within 6 years. I haven't seen the data, but I think that number is even lower for STEM-interested students. So we know that just taking this path, which again disproportionately includes Black, Latino students and students from poverty, just taking that path makes it less likely that Marcus would actually make it through. Marcus also got put into developmental math. We know what happens to students who get put in developmental math sequences. This is great data from CCRC. Students who are placed into developmental math, some of them don't even bother to start. They just are so demoralized by the potential of that path that they'd stop. And many of them at each stage, some of them drop out of this. And in fact, in their study, only 11% of the students eventually pass the gatekeeper math. In Marcus's case, that's calculus. So this is, it's a system set up to help people fail, not to help people propel them toward their dreams. And one of the things that I just want to point out of this is this phenomenon has a great name, exponential attrition, right? So even if each one of these classes has like a 70% success rate, multiplying 70% times itself 3 times gives you fairly low success rates. And when you add in the students who sort of drop out somewhere along the line, that's how you get these low pass rates. Let's look at what Marcus overcame through this, right? And so he overcame the lack of math. He overcame these developmental sequences. And incidentally, we know now we can do much better than that by putting students in the goal course and giving them co-requisite supports. But again, just like Maria, this system levied a tax on him. It levied a tax in terms of 1 extra year at the community college and another extra year when he transferred. There's a whole host of issues when students transfer. Not all of their classes transfer. Sometimes they transfer as credits, but they don't apply to their desired program. And so again, it's an unjust tax just because of the part of the system that he went through. And in addition to the things I've already mentioned, that's 2 years of his life that he's lost. So he's going to start earning 2 years later. Those lost earnings are sort of an additional tax. When we look and think about Maria and Marcus, it's really important to ask, like, what would a system look like that would meet the needs of all students, including students like Maria, who are not interested in STEM, and students like Marcus, who are interested in STEM fields, but currently don't have the support needed to get through the system in an efficient way. Um, so, a lot of today's the rhetoric we're talking about these days in the country is about finding differences, and I always prefer to start with what we all agree on. So let's look at a system that at least the parts of a system that we all agree on. So I think everybody agrees that calculus is an incredibly important topic. I've taught calculus something like 15 or 20 times. I love calculus, and it is exactly the mathematics needed if you have an interest in a STEM field or economics or something like that. But there's also a consensus that, especially at the college level, different students need different mathematics. And if you're heading towards something in the humanities, a course that's in a quantitative reasoning course or a math for liberal arts course, that's much more aligned with your interests. And it's totally appropriate to have a requirement that's a quantitative reasoning requirement instead of something along the pathway to calculus. If you're heading towards social sciences, a pathway in statistics is really what's appropriate for you. And I think at the college level, there's near universal agreement that these sorts of different math classes are appropriate for different students. It's also true that when you look at workforce needs, it's clear from workforce needs that it's more than just calculus, that statistics is increasingly important. Quantitative reasoning and sort of critical thinking are more important. Increased use of data is more important. And we need to make sure students are getting those experiences in their last math classes. And a system like this, there's increasing agreement that systems like this serve our workforce in addition to serving students' needs. If we look on the other end of this, there's increasing agreement that everybody should be together at least through Algebra 1, or at least sort of an updated version of Algebra 1. So the big question here is what happens in between? If everybody's together in Algebra 1, maybe not at the same time, maybe some students taking it earlier than others, and everybody is differentiated by the time they get to college, how exactly does this branching process happen? How do we branch? When do we do it? What do the courses look like? What do the choices look like? How do we make sure students are doing it with an understanding of what the implications are? And how do we do it equitably? If we just have additional pathways and calculus is still seen as the premium pathway, what we're going to see is under-resourced students are just sloughed off into what are seen as the lesser pathways. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, there's a lot of interesting work going on in this space, and I just want to highlight some of the different ways that states are answering these really difficult questions. So here's one branching model. So one branching model is to take the traditional sequence and then update Algebra 2. So for instance, in Georgia, they've taken about 30% of the really outdated material in Algebra 2, rationalizing denominators and things like synthetic division, taken that out and replaced it with more modern content aligned with the 21st century. A lot of work on data, some linear algebra. And students are taking that, and after that, you could choose a path to calculus through pre-calculus, or you could choose a different path toward a quantitative reasoning class that would head toward the humanities, or you could choose a statistics class that would head toward social sciences. And I want to highlight those arrows on the right. I think it's really key that we make sure any options we have for high school students are aligned with higher education. They have to lead somewhere of value, a degree, whether it's a 2 or 4 year degree or a certificate. We know that if you don't aim at that, some people talk about like it having things that are for students who aren't college material. We know from data in lots of places that that is relegating people to a life that where poverty is almost certainly their future. In Central Texas, if you do not get a credential of some sort in the 6 years after you graduate from high school, you have a 12% chance of having a living wage. 12%. And so it's really important that we make sure any options we have in high school, especially in that senior year of high school, are aligned with higher education. I want to point out one more thing. It's important to have these options, especially because students should be taking some math in their senior year. And it's another thing that Georgia does incredibly well. 98% of students of high school seniors in Georgia are taking some math, and increasingly that's math that's aligned with their interests. Other states are deciding to branch earlier. Here's a model that some places are doing. Washington and Oregon are updating geometry, putting more data science into that course. and then allowing students to have choices after that, whether it's a quantitative reasoning course, calculus, or statistics or data science. And increasingly, some people are thinking, oh, wait, that Algebra 2 pre-calculus sequence, there's a lot of stuff we can take out of there, and maybe we can merge those into a single course. So it's a single course that prepares you for calculus. The real benefit of that is that you could then get students to calculus starting with 9th grade algebra. In Ohio, it's not just quantitative reasoning and statistics. They also, in some schools, have courses in programming that are that are another pathway, and in data science. Let's look at one more model here that's a little bit more revolutionary. In some places, including some places in California and the entire state of Idaho, they've replaced this algebra, geometry, algebra 2 sandwich with integrated math 1, 2, and 3. One of the things I love about this is if the names are no longer tied to what the content you have, then you can change the content if needed. So if in 10 years we need something new in there, if you call it algebra, geometry, algebra 2, you're really stuck a little bit. If you call it integrated 1, 2, and 3, you have a lot more flexibility. And after integrated 3, students can go straight on to calculus, or they could choose a different pathway. And again, all of those pathways have nice on-ramps into higher education. Now, none of these models is easy to implement, and there are tons of issues that are rising as we work with different states in this work. I just want to highlight a few of them. So first of all, equitable implementation is incredibly difficult. It requires very intentional work in the counseling and advising space. It requires attention to data, right? Constantly collecting data and seeing how we're doing in terms of equity. Quantitative reasoning, that quantitative reasoning option just is, there's a lot of different things going on in that space. And so we really need to nationally think about having greater uniformity. And as part of greater uniformity, we would get greater legitimacy. One of the things we've done recently, we worked with the NCAA to make sure that quantitative reasoning courses were included in a list that already included, statistics, calculus, pre-calculus, and data science. We wanted to make sure quantitative reasoning was in there. And so that's now in the NCAA's list, so that students who take that, it's part of their eligibility to be Division I athletes. We also see data science, that there's just a lot of uncertainty about what data science is, and in particular, what the mathematics is that should be included in a high school data science. It's just not clear where data science fits. Maybe eventually it'll sort of be merged with the statistics pathway, at least in high school, but it's not clear where that's headed. I haven't talked at all in this session yet about pedagogy. Pedagogy is incredibly important, and attention to socio-emotional factors. Students need to see themselves. They need to be motivated. They need to be engaged. They need to see themselves as successful math students, and we know that that's less likely to be true for minoritized students, for students who don't otherwise see themselves in the science and the math professionals that they see in the media. We also know that persistence is really key. High quality instruction materials, we have to have those, and we just have to acknowledge that in this space where different states are doing different things, getting high quality instructional materials is going to be a challenge. The extent to which states can work together to sort of maybe instead of having 51 different systems, to have a smaller number of systems, it'll make high quality instructional materials a little bit easier to provide. And finally, what do we do about Algebra 2? There's so much in Algebra 2 that's just outdated. Do we keep that structure, just update some of the content? Do we combine it with pre-calculus? If we remove some of the computational parts of calculus, it would be easier to combine, keep Algebra 2 and pre-calculus into a single year that would propel students toward calculus. There's just a lot of unknowns about Algebra 2. And finally, the alignment with workforce needs, especially these non-degree credentials. We could do a lot to make sure the mathematics we're offering is aligned with, with the future in nursing, or a future in manufacturing, or something in the trades. These are all really important pathways, and we need to make sure the mathematics we're giving students is aligned with those. The Launch Years Initiative is what the Dana Center is doing to work on this. The goal here is that we support scaling of math pathways from high school through post-secondary into the workforce, and make sure those are aligned with students' goals and aspirations. The first edition of the Launch Years Initiative started in 2019, and it worked with just 3 states. Georgia, I've already talked about. Washington also did some great work to modernize their Algebra 2. Texas, we had the right people in the task force, but COVID hit, and that took up all the oxygen in the room. We're now moving on. We're a year into Launch Years 2.0. We are working with 22 states across the country. Each one of those states has a high-level state team, usually including like the K-12 math lead and somebody from the system level. And we're working to support those state leaders. We also have support from state leaders within those states. That was part of the commitment they made, and they made a commitment to 3 years of work on this. One of the things we have as part of the Launch Years initiative is cross-state learning sessions, and those are open to all, not just the 22 states that we're working with. We've had folks from 15 additional states show up. They are exchanging ideas. They are learning from each other. That includes folks from Pennsylvania, Illinois, Florida, from Texas. They are learning a lot from each other. And in this system, in this place where we don't have a tight collaboration, there isn't sort of a common core that's bringing everybody together. Provides a space to have loose collaboration. We're going to make sure you have information if you want to come and get more information about the Launch Years initiative and come to our sessions. Overall, I think Bob Moses was really right that there's so much riding on high school mathematics, that there's a high school diploma, there's access to future education, there's high value STEM careers. Like, access to and success in high school math really is a civil right. And it's a big problem. Changing systems like this are really hard. There's no single person, there's no single organization, there isn't even a single state that can implement the kinds of changes that we're talking about, the kinds of changes that we need to. Nobody can do it alone. We have to work together. But if we work together, we can update the content. We can broaden our ideas of what mathematics is to include other topics, things that are more aligned with what we need in the 21st century, so that students have access to the math that they need, no matter what it is that they're doing. And we can also address equity. We can broaden our understanding of who does mathematics so that all students, including students like Maria and Marcus, have an easier path forward without the artificial barriers that both of these two overcame, but so many like them didn't. Working together, we can do this. We can make sure that every single student in this country has access to and success in mathematics that aligns with their aspirations. Thanks very much. I look forward to your questions. Thanks so much. I'm glad you came to this session. I appreciate you attending. I appreciate you coming to the summit. I also want to thank all the organizers. Took an enormous amount of work for IES and OSTP and all the other groups that were involved to put this on. So I'm looking forward to your questions. There's a bit of a delay, so once you put a question in there, it'll take me a little bit before you hear the answer. I might actually answer it quickly. You just won't know it. But I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. I think there's a lot of moving parts right now in this space. I tried to highlight some of the states that are doing, I think, particularly good work. But of course, I didn't have time to highlight all of the states. So I do think it's a time when we're questioning a lot of what's going on in high school mathematics. And I think it's a huge opportunity to maybe, update some of the things that we have just sort of taken for granted. Some of the topics, some of the ways in which things are taught. So a lot of great things to think about right now. Laura, you have a great question. Like, what grade level does the pathway to college begin? I think Zalyu Siskin in the Chicago area used to joke about how he knew his kid was on a path toward the Ivy Leagues in like first grade when he was put in the high level math group, right? And I think that's unfortunately the truth of the current system, is that because we have tracking, whether it's tracking sort of internal, whether it's tracking sort of at the school level where we fund schools differently, and some schools have access to things that other schools don't, or whether we're internal at a school and we have different classrooms for different students, or even internal in a classroom, like tracking students to like the FAST group. Because we have that sort of tracking, the pathway to college really does start early, and that's something we need to address, right? I think sort of implicit in your question though is like, where should we start thinking about math being college level math? And I think that that's something that's changing. I think what college level math is changing, right? So if you go back to the 70s, it was actually not the case that every college student had to have math. a lot of students didn't have math in college and still got a college degree. And so requiring college students to have math is a fairly recent thing. And it's even more recent that we've decided that like different college students need different things and need different mathematics. And because that decision is now not uniform, but pretty well established in most places in higher education, now we can go back and say, okay, well, if students who are really interested in social sciences need something like statistics, when can we give them statistics, and when can we split them from other students? And so I think increasingly what we see is that people are thinking about the last year of high school, especially, as a place where students should be ready to take college mathematics. And if we provide them those opportunities, they'll do really well. Let's see, I'm trying to read these really quickly. So Stephen is saying, there's a logic to having different pathways have different mathematics. The problem is that kids don't really know what level they want to do, right? And so I think this is important. This is an important point, and I think the language of pathways actually does us a little bit of a disservice. Over in history, they don't talk about, a pathway to American history and a pathway to European history. It's history, and like you can take a modern American class, and then you can go back and take a medieval European history. Math, because we sort of think of things logically as stacked and sort of following a progression, we tend to think of that sort of puts us in a space of thinking about it in terms of pathways. I think we would be better served if we just talked about options, and you have a number of options. Like if you want to take a data science class and you're in high school, we should have options available for you. And if that data science class gets you really interested, well, if you want to study data science at the college level, you really do need calculus and probably linear algebra as well. And so maybe you take data science, that gets you really excited about mathematics, and then you go back and take the pre-calculus and then calculus that's necessary for that. So I think there's a disservice in thinking about these as pathways. Hong Wen, yeah, so you have a great question about like what are outdated math contents. If you're not sure about that, I really encourage you to go find somebody who teaches Algebra 2. As far as I know, every Algebra 2 teacher I've talked to can name some of the things that they are forced to teach, like forced by their local school district, forced by state requirements, forced by these things. They're forced to teach, even though they know it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, the most egregious of these examples that I've seen wasn't actually at high school, but it's very much related. I went to a college algebra class. It was a co-rec support class. And these students, none of them wanted STEM degrees, but they were in college algebra because it was a requirement. I think a bunch of them were nursing majors. Don't get me started on whether or not nurses need to be able to factor polynomials. But the topic that they were doing was synthetic division of cubic polynomials with complex coefficients. I'm a math nerd. Like I love that kind of stuff, but this is not the kind of stuff that leads anywhere. It's certainly not a prerequisite for calculus. So we need to rethink, like, what are the things that are in our classes? And exactly where do they lead? Like, why do we need to be teaching those? And if the answer is we don't need them, then let's make time so that teachers and students have time to explore these ideas and really understand them at a much deeper level. And that goes to pedagogy and things like that, including Steve Linewan's fantastic talk about pedagogy in high schools. Tom Hagedorn, hi Tom. In your local school district, they've started a conversation about new math pathways, but the conversation broke down. New pathways, how can we keep these conversations constructive without them developing into divisive arguments? That's such a great question. I think bringing higher ed and high school math folks together to have these conversations is incredibly important, and especially higher ed folks who have done the hard work at their institutions to figure out which math courses are aligned with which majors, or one of the things we talk about at the Dana Center a lot is which meta majors, like which groups of majors should be aligned with quantitative reasoning. And when higher ed folks have done that work, they've had conversations across their institutions to better understand who sort of needs what. And when you get those higher ed folks in the same room with high school folks, you have and you get some good facilitating there. It's possible to work through these issues, which Tom, as you've seen, can get very contentious. and can put people on edge a little bit. I also want to just acknowledge that a lot of what's going on in these conversations is that people are worried that, if there isn't this prized pathway to calculus that their precious kid is on and they think is going to like propel them into the Ivy Leagues, they are really reluctant to dismantle a system which gives their kid an edge. And we have to be honest about that. Like, we have to be honest with ourselves, but we also have to be honest, like, with students like Marcus and Maria that I highlighted. Those are pseudonyms, but those are real people and their stories are real. We have to be honest that we're in a system which really, which provides lots of privileges for some and takes away lots of opportunities from others. And so we have to be honest about that. I want to live in a world where everybody, no matter what their, what their zip code, no matter what their interests, I want to make sure everybody has access to and success in mathematics. Like, we need to sort of broaden our understanding of what it means to do mathematics, both in terms of who can do it and in terms of what we do in those classrooms. So I think once we have those conversations, and some of those are honest conversations, I think those conversations can be productive. So I really appreciate that, Tom. Good luck in those conversations. Drop me a line sometime. I'd love to help out. And Stephen has a second question here. Some huge numbers of high school students don't even offer calculus as an option. Right, that even happened in San Francisco. I think this is really tough. I personally think that we need to make sure there's a pathway to calculus for high school students. I also think that we should be able to figure out, like, some places have a path to calculus that starts in 9th grade algebra and gets you to calculus. I think there are enough things out there, like, just to give you some sense, we teach algebra and then geometry, and then what happens in algebra 2? Well, most teachers spend the first month or two reviewing algebra 1. Well, that's really silly, right? We can develop a system that keeps students up with algebra through that second year, so that when they get into something like algebra 2, we don't have to do that much reviewing. And if we compress things like that, then I think we can make a system where you do algebra, geometry, or some modernized versions of those, and then there's a course which does some of the things that are in algebra 2, some of the things that are in pre-calculus, and prepares you for a modern calculus course.